Okay, so this lecture will be on section 2 of chapter 4, and we will focus on ethical issues as they relate specifically to human participants. So, a little bit of background. Prior to the Second World War, it was sort of a wild west in terms of research ethics. There were no official codes or rules in place, and really it was left up to the moral compass of the scientist conducting the study. Now, in some cases, that moral compass was well calibrated, and in some cases, it wasn't. So, after World War II, when the horrors that took place under Nazi Germany started coming to light, people were shocked and appalled regarding the barbarism which was discovered in a nation that was considered to be very advanced and cultured. And it was discovered that the Nazis, in addition to exterminating people, in addition to working people to death, also performed extremely sadistic and inhumane experiments, medical experiments, on humans, on the prisoners in the concentration camps. And we're talking amputations, breaking of bones, exposure to viruses and various chemical agents, exposure to extreme temperatures. I mean, the deeper you go down this rabbit hole, the darker and more depraved it becomes. So when these atrocities were discovered, when they came to light, the international community decided something has to be done. At the very least, we need a code of ethics governing research on human beings. So in 1947, the Nazi atrocities inspired what are called the Nuremberg Code. And the Nuremberg Code is a set of 10 guidelines for the ethical treatment of humans in research. So here they are, and let's take a moment to go through these. All right, so number 1 is voluntary informed consent. So two aspects here, voluntary and informed. Voluntary means the person must have the capacity to give consent in the absence of force or threats or coercion. It has to be voluntary consent. And 2, informed means the person must have all the relevant information needed to give consent, to make the decision for themselves. They have to have some sense of what the study is about, what the study will entail, what will be required of them, how long will the study take, and any possible risks or discomforts that they may encounter. So again, all the information that a rational person may need to make an informed decision and presented in a way that's clear and easy to understand. Okay. 2, fruitful results for the good of society. And that can mean, advancing basic knowledge in some field. But, the study should not be random or unnecessary. It has to serve some purpose. It has to be for the good of society. 3, prior experimentation on animals and prior knowledge of the problem. Now, this is more applicable, for example, to medical research, where, let's say, you're testing a drug. You have to first test that drug on animals before you can run human trials. So again, experimentation on animals when relevant and prior knowledge of the problem. 4, avoidance of unnecessary physical or mental injury. This is pretty self-explanatory. If there is some risk associated with the study, it has to be because that risk is necessary and there's no other way of performing that study. So for example, if you're studying fear or sadness, it may be necessary to show people disturbing images to induce those mental states. But if you're studying basic visual processes like color or motion, then there's no justification for using disturbing images and having people experience unpleasant emotions. Okay, number 5, banning of known lethal or disabling procedures. Again, pretty self-explanatory. Meaning, if there's any reason to believe that your experiment will result in death or disability, then you can't run it. Sorry, tough luck. 6, the risks should not exceed the benefits. So in studies that do have some risk, that risk has to be justified by the potential benefits of the study. So for example, in drug studies, there are risks in the form of side effects that aren't always predictable, that for some people are very serious. But there are also benefits if your drug aims to cure some disease, be it physical or mental. So in that situation, you can argue that the benefits outweigh the potential risks. 7, proper preparation of facilities to prevent injury or death. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Number 8, performance of experiments by only scientifically qualified people. In other words, please don't try this at home. Make sure the people running the studies know what they are doing. 9, participants may freely end the experiment. So participants have the right to end the experiment at any point, at least for themselves. So if someone chooses to revoke their consent halfway through the study, you have to let them go. You can't force them to continue against their will. That would be deeply unethical. And 10, the experiment must stop if it is too dangerous. So you, the scientist, it is your responsibility to terminate the experiment immediately if you have good reason to believe that significant physical or psychological harm has occurred or is imminent. So in 1964, the Declaration of Helsinki was written, and it provides international ethics guidelines for medical research. Now, we won't read it here, but I invite you to look through it on your own, and you'll notice many similarities to the Nuremberg Code. In fact, the Nuremberg Code laid the groundwork for the Declaration of Helsinki and many of the codes of ethics that are used in research today. So, despite the Nuremberg Code and this agreement on ethical guidelines, cases of maltreatment continue to occur in medical research. For example, in the 60s, in 1963, there was a study that injected patients with live cancer cells. There was the Tuskegee syphilis study, where 400 men were untreated for syphilis, even though a cure in the form of penicillin was available. And of course, this caused a lot of unnecessary suffering. So in the previous slide, we saw examples of physical harm arising from medical studies. But there are also several examples of studies in psychology that have also raised eyebrows, not by inflicting physical harm, but by inflicting psychological harm. And one famous example is the Milgram study. This was a study on obedience and how far people are willing to go to obey an authority figure. So here's the schematic of the study. So imagine you're the volunteer. This is you. You are the tester. This is the experimenter conducting the study. This is the authority figure. And in a different room here is the learner, somebody you believe is a part of the study. Now, you are told that the purpose of the study is to examine the effects of punishment on memory, which of course is a lie. That's not the purpose of the study at all. So already we have one potential ethical issue. You are lying to people in the study, but it gets worse. So in the study, the learner in the other room performs some memory test, and when they make a mistake, it is your job to flip a switch and deliver an electric shock. Now, of course, the learner is not actually being shocked. They are in on the study, they're part of the study, but you don't know that. You believe that they're being shocked. So every time they make an error, your job is to deliver the punishment in the form of the shock and increase the voltage for every mistake. So the study unfolds with the learner making more and more mistakes. For each mistake, you deliver a shock that gets stronger and stronger. And after a while, the learner, who you can hear through a speaker, begins screaming and begging you to stop, saying they're in pain, they're terrified, please stop. Meanwhile, the experimenter, the authority figure, tells you you must keep going. It is critical that you keep going. It is essential that we continue this study. And the question is, how far are people willing to go when obeying an authority? And the results are somewhat pessimistic. Approximately 65% of the people in the study went up to the maximum voltage, even as the learner is begging you to stop, even after the learner goes silent and stops responding. And the maximum voltage was potentially lethal had this been actual electricity. Now again, in reality, nobody actually got hurt. In reality, this was a sham in the name of science. But the participants didn't know that. They didn't know that this was all an act. And so many suffered a lot of stress and anxiety during the study as the learner is screaming in pain. And after the study, when they learned what was going on, many felt extremely ashamed and embarrassed at what they did, or what they could have potentially done had those shocks been real. And so the ethical issues here are quite clear, right? The people that partook in the study experienced a lot of psychological distress. So this questionable treatment of humans in various research studies, although it wasn't very common, led to the development of ethical guidelines, more ethical guidelines. So in the 1960s, the US General required institutions that receive federal funding to review all research proposals to protect the human participants. In 1974, the National Research Act mandated regulations for human participant protection and established the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. And finally, in 1979, the Belmont Report proposed and outlined a number of basic ethical principles for protecting human participants in research. And those principles include respect for persons, the principle of beneficence, and the principle of justice. And we'll talk about these in some more detail. So these are the three principles of the Belmont Report, and I'll just read them because I think they're pretty important. Okay, so 1, respect for persons. This principle emphasizes the importance of treating individuals as autonomous agents, capable of making informed decisions about their participation in research. It includes the requirement for informed consent, ensuring that participants are fully aware of the research's nature, its risks and benefits, and consent to participate freely. Additionally, it calls for extra protection for those with diminished autonomy, such as minors or those with cognitive impairments. Okay, so we see the idea of informed consent being fleshed out. People need information about the study and must be able to give consent freely. And also extra protection for people with diminished capacities due to age, whether very young or very old, or people with other sorts of cognitive deficits or impairments. All right, 2, the principle of beneficence. Beneficence involves an obligation to ensure the well-being of the participants by maximizing possible benefits and minimizing potential harm. Researchers must conduct thorough risk-benefit analyses to ensure that the benefits of the research justify the risks. The principle of beneficence extends beyond the individual participants, considering the potential benefits to society and contributing to the greater good. All right, so you want to make sure that you're not hurting anyone. Make sure that you are minimizing risks and maximizing benefits to society at large. And finally, number 3, the principle of justice. The principle of justice focuses on the equitable distribution of the benefits and burdens of research. It seeks to prevent the exploitation of vulnerable populations and ensures that no group is unfairly burdened or excluded from the potential benefits of research. Justice in research involves considerations of who participates, who stands to benefit, and how the benefits and risks are distributed among different groups in society. All right, so the American Psychological Association, the APA, developed its first set of ethical guidelines in 1973. And it was in response to concerns raised by studies like Milgram's obedience study with the electric shocks. And so these APA guidelines are, periodically revised and updated. And so the APA Ethics Code contains 10 ethical standards that researchers must be familiar with before conducting research on human participants. And those standards are no harm, privacy and confidentiality, institutional approval, competence, record keeping, informed consent, dispensing with informed consent, offering inducements, deception, and debriefing. And we'll talk about some of these standards, not all, but we'll go through some. And of course, you will see intimations and influences from the Belmont Report and the Nuremberg Code, etc. All right, so no harm, meaning researchers must protect participants from physical and psychological harm and minimize or remove risks whenever possible. Any potential risk that may exist has to be justified, and the benefits of the study should outweigh the risks. For example, this trade-off happens all the time in medicine. You may be given a medication that has side effects, which is a harm. Side effects can be very harmful. But the potential benefits from the medication justify the harms from the side effects. Or consider something like chemotherapy. which inflicts havoc on the body. It's terrible. But the purpose of those harms is because of the greater benefits that come from potentially killing or slowing down the cancer. Now, in the behavioral sciences, psychological harm is much more common than physical harm. So we talked about Milgram's study, for example, and the stress and the anxiety and the shame and embarrassment that the participants suffered. So some studies have manipulations designed to induce unpleasant psychological states like fear, sadness, anxiety, a sense of failure, if that's what you're studying. Some research may be on sensitive topics like violence or sexual abuse, which can re-traumatize a person who's maybe had those experiences. So it's important that researchers give as much information as they can prior to the study, without giving away certain key components, and then explain everything, including the purpose of the study, once the study is over, and also make themselves available to answer any questions that people may have. And this may help participants feel better about the situation, even if they had some unpleasant experiences that occurred during the study. So, no harm also implies that researchers must anticipate, remove, and monitor for any potential harmful elements that may occur in a research study. They have to continuously monitor the participants' well-being and halt the study if any signs of harm arise. Now, one example is another famous study from the Annals of Psychology, and this is the Zimbardo prison study. And in the study, undergraduates were instructed to assume the roles of guards or the roles of prisoners. And after a few days, the guards started becoming very aggressive and treating the prisoners very inhumanely, while the prisoners began showing signs of depression and anxiety. The people were falling into their roles and becoming their roles. So you can argue this was maybe unethical to begin with, but Zimbardo did halt the study when he noticed the psychological toll that it was taking on the participants. So again, the idea is it is your responsibility to stop the study immediately if you notice any signs of harm. Okay, so informed consent, another critical principle in the ethics of research. And there are three sort of dimensions of informed consent, and that is information, understanding, and voluntary participation. Okay, so information. People have to receive all the relevant information that is required for them to make an educated decision as to whether they want to participate or not, including information about risks, any potential risks or discomforts, anything physical or emotional has to be disclosed. Now, in some cases, you can't provide all the information. Some studies involve deception, which gets a little tricky. But whenever possible, you have to disclose as much information as you can about the study and any risks that are involved. Next is understanding. You want to make sure that people have understood the study. They've understood what they're agreeing to. This can be especially difficult with special populations, young kids, people with disabilities, people with psychiatric conditions, people that are nonverbal for whatever reason. So you have to figure out ways to make sure that they understand. And sometimes you have to obtain consent not from the person but from the guardian. So when working with kids or special populations. And it's really important that researchers use normal, everyday, understandable language when asking questions and providing information to potential participants. And also, people should be encouraged to ask questions. Any questions they may have, they should feel free to raise. And finally, the third component, the third principle, is voluntary participation, consent. So participants should be free to participate of their own free will. And you have to be very mindful of the existence of power dynamics that can create pressure or coercion in different situations. And finally, it's important to emphasize that a participant is free to decline. You don't have to participate. And even if they agree to participate, they can always change their mind and stop at any time without any negative consequences or ramifications. Okay, so in most studies, people will be asked to sign what is called a consent form, and the consent form provides all the information that a participant should need about the study. So here are some of the sections that you will find in a consent form, and we'll mention some of them. So the overview is, of course, an overview of the study, sort of a big picture. What is the study about? Description of procedures. What will the study actually entail? Will you hear things? Will you see things? Will you feel things? What does the study actually consist of? Any risks or inconveniences? Any benefits? Economic considerations, charges or payments. Confidentiality and assurance that information will be kept confidential, especially personal information of the participant. Voluntary participation, of course, people are not obligated to participate. It is voluntary. And at the end, there is a signature line. And so the signature of the participant is taken as the evidence of informed consent, the voluntary consent to participate in the study. That being said, somebody that signed a consent form can still back out after the form has been signed. All right, so another ethical issue is the issue of deception. And we've alluded to this issue in some of the previous slides. And so deception may be necessary in some studies. There are some studies where if you were to disclose the actual purpose of the experiment to the participants, it would ruin the experiment. It would change the behavior of the participants in a way that contaminates the study completely. So there are two types of deception. There's passive deception. This is omission. This is when you withhold information about the true purpose of the study. And then there's active deception, commission. This is when you present false or misleading information deliberately. So if you want an analogy, passive deception is keeping secrets, while active deception is telling lies. Okay, so an example of passive deception is a famous study by Craik and Lockhart, 1972. And you may have encountered this study in cognitive psychology or intro to psych. If you recall the levels of processing theory, in the context of memory, the idea being the level at which you process a stimulus will impact how well you encode and later retrieve that information. So the deeper the processing, the better the encoding and subsequent retrieval of that information. So in the study by Craig and Lockhart, they had people look at words, and they had people attend to different characteristics of the word, different properties. In one condition, they had to look at the font, answer questions about the font. In another condition, they had to answer questions about how the word sounds. And in the third condition, they had to answer questions about what the word means, so focusing on the meaning of the word. And then they were all given a surprise memory test. And the people that focused on meaning, the deeper level of processing, recalled more words than those who focused on the superficial levels, the font or the sound of the word. And so in this case, the people were passively deceived because they weren't told about the true purpose of the study. If you would have told them you would get a memory test on these words, then they would try to memorize the words, and it would defeat the purpose of the study. So that's an example of passive deception. You're not overtly lying, but you're withholding information strategically. All right, so here's an example of active deception. And this is a famous study by Solomon and Asch from the 50s, studying conformity. Now, already, if you're studying conformity, you're probably not going to tell the participants the true purpose of your study. And this was true in this particular study, where Solomon and Asch created a fake environment filled with Confederates. Now, Confederates are people that are in on the study, almost like actors, but you don't know that. You think these are real people behaving autonomously, when in fact they're playing some role to create a fake environment, kind of like the Truman Show. And you're the star of the Truman Show. Okay, so in the study, the participants were told that they would be tested on their visual perception, their visual abilities. And this was active deception because that's not the purpose of the study. They were being lied to actively. The real purpose of the study was studying conformity. And so in this experiment, people saw the following stimulus, a target line, and the task was to select which of these lines, A, B, or C, is the same length as the target line. Now the answer is obviously A. You can see that. But now imagine the study design. So you're in a room with 12 other people who you think are participants, ordinary people, but in fact they're Confederates. They're there to deceive you. And the participant, the experimenter asks the first individual to pick the line that matches the target line in length. And now imagine, to your surprise, the first person chooses C instead of A. And you go, oh, that's weird. What's wrong with that guy? And then the second person chooses C. And the third chooses C. And the fourth chooses C. And the fifth, and so on. And all 12 people ahead of you all chose C. And now it's your turn. And all eyes are on you. And the question is, do you conform to the masses, to the crowd, to the group, or do you go with the right answer? And the answer is, the findings from the study, if my memory serves correct, I think between 30 and 40%, so a sizable minority, conformed and said C was the same length as the target line. And this shows you the power of conformity. Anyway, it's a fascinating study, but the point is that's an example of active deception. People were lied and told this was a study on visual perception, when in fact the purpose was completely different. So the guidelines for using deception in research, one, you have to justify the use of deception by weighing the benefits of the study against the rights of the participants. And of course, the study has to be approved by an ethical review group or committee. And we'll talk more about that in the future slides. Two, researchers cannot conceal information about potential risks or harms. So if your study involves the potential of significant risks, you can't lie about that. You can't deceive people about that. That they have to know about. And three, you have to debrief participants after the study. So once the study is over, you have to tell them the full purpose of the study and why deception had to be used. You have to counteract any negative effects of the study. You have to explain the value of this study and the value of the research that you're doing. And of course, you have to make yourself available to answer any and all questions that the participant might have. So another major ethical issue is confidentiality. And confidentiality refers to keeping private all personal information related to your participants. So personal information comes in many flavors. For example, attitudes and opinions. If you're running a study which involves disclosing various beliefs that somebody has about religion or politics, about any prejudice or preferences that a person may have, you can't make those public. Okay? At least you can't identify specific individuals and their answers to your questions. That's inappropriate. Measures of performance. If your experiment involves reaction time or accuracy or memory or attention, you can't disclose how well people did on those measures. And of course, demographic characteristics. People's income, people's sexual orientation. Of course, you shouldn't out people. All of that has to remain private as well. So confidentiality is often ensured through anonymity, which is the act of not associating the name of the person with the specific measurement or data point that is being collected. So confidentiality can be maintained in two different ways. One is when there's no identification on data records. And this occurs if there's really no reason, no necessity to link any individual to their measurements or their data, like an anonymous survey. And in this case, nobody in the universe knows which data point is linked to which individual. Now, another approach is coding systems. And this is when there is some necessity or some reason to link the data with individual people. And so in this case, what you do is you create a code for each participant. So Bob Smith becomes 867013, some random numbers or digits. Okay, that's their code. And then you have a separate secured list that connects people to their codes. But anybody working with the data only sees the code and not the identity of the person. So the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services requires that all research involving human participants is reviewed by a panel, a committee called the Institutional Review Board, the IRB. And this has to be in place for any institution that receives government funding. And they basically have to review to make sure that the research is in compliance with federal regulations and the principles of the Belmont Report. So the IRB is a panel of people. It's composed of both scientists and non-scientists. And their job is to review research proposals, specifically in the context of ethical treatment of human subjects. Now, the IRB has a number of criteria by which each proposal gets evaluated. And if the proposal fails to meet one of those criterion, then your proposal will be rejected and you will not be able to conduct that study. All right, so here are the 7 criteria that the IRB uses to evaluate research proposals that involve the use of human participants. So we'll just go through these. One is minimizing the risk to the participants. So you have to avoid unnecessary exposure to risk. You have to justify any component of your study that is potentially risky. And you have to explore alternative and less risky methods if they are available. 2, reasonable risk in relation to benefits. So you have to do the risk-benefit analysis. You have to assess potential risks and benefits, and you have to weigh the risks against the benefits for both the participants and the society at large. 3, equitable selection. So this entails ensuring that participant selection does not discriminate against any specific populations. And also you have to prevent exploitation of vulnerable groups. And that includes children, people with disabilities, and people that are impaired or institutionalized. 4 is informed consent. So you have to guarantee that participants will receive complete and comprehensible information. All the information that they would need to make a decision presented to them in a way that is comprehensible, digestible. And also they have to know about their right to withdraw from the study and to say no. 5, documentation of informed consent. Determine whether written consent signed by participants and researchers is necessary. So sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's not. 6, data monitoring. So monitor research data for unexpected risks or harm to participants, and you have to be ready to interrupt the study if any potential harm is detected. And finally, 7 is privacy and confidentiality. Protect participants from risks associated with the release of personal information, and that could include their demographic information, their names and personal info, and also their data that you collect in the study.